Hi everyone. So this lecture focuses on the reading "We Don't Sleep Around Like White Girls Do," which is which is basically from this week. This particular article, it's really essential that you're able to answer these following questions. What is the author's argument? How did the author get her information? What did you find interesting or intriguing about the article? Is this only a story about Filipinas, or can this apply to other groups? And why might this article be important for understanding race relations? These particular questions are at the center of really being able to understand and comprehend the sort of numerous facets of this particular article. In particular, you need to be able to understand stratification as it relates to this article. So, stratification basically refers to the ways in which some groups have either increased access or decreased access to power, resources, education, capital, social networks, and life chances. In essence, when it comes to stratification, it's important to note that stratification is when we categorize and rank groups on the basis of social worth, and that it's a group's location in the hierarchy that determines their life chances. So, looking particularly at this pyramid, I've depicted, we want to picture that each of these levels is a social group, and that based on the social category, we rank order them. Those who are on the top have the increased access, and those that are on the bottom actually have decreased access to these life chances. Sometimes stratification may be class based, where those who make the least amount of money or who are in poverty are at the bottom, and those who represent like the top 1% who have most of the wealth accumulated are at the top. But there are numerous ways in which stratification occurs. And if you've studied intro to sociology, you already know that we use stratification, or the sort of different ways in which some groups are ranked higher than others, or considered more superior than others in terms of being socially constructed, that we look at stratification based on race, class, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, gender, and many, many other social categories. And so in this particular article, Espiritu focuses on numerous forms of stratification and how it impacts, in particular, Filipino lives. In order to truly understand this article, you have to have a little bit of background on the Philippines. For those of you who don't know, the Philippines as a country were colonized by the Spanish for over 100 years, and then subsequently were colonized by the United States. As you already read in the other reading, being colonized means that there is either kind of a military or political takeover or administration of that country, which influences every part of their social life. The reason why the United States wanted to be in the Philippines is that it was a strategic military site. For those of you who are familiar with our U.S. military, we have a very large naval base based in the Philippines. And that it is this base that has really been influential in how Filipino citizens have interacted with Americans. It's a strategic military site because if you look back at the different military conflicts that we've had, or the skirmishes we've had, we know that we could look at the fact that during World War II, in particular, our interest in the Japanese was important. You had the Korean War, you had the Vietnam War. We could also look at the period that we called the Cold War in terms of the former USSR, as well as other communist countries like China, North Korea, and Vietnam. And then, of course, we have the Middle East conflicts, which include Iraq, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan. And just if you were to look at a simple map, you would see that having a military installation in the Philippines is strategically important because it gives us a place that's much closer to the United States to be able to refuel, to pick up new troops, for our troops to get rest, etc. So the Philippines is not the only area where we have a military base, but strategically speaking, this has been really important in terms of U.S. foreign relations. Now, it's important to note that oftentimes when we think about the fact that we have military installments in different countries, we don't often think about the influence it has on the citizens of the country in which we're residing. And so what's important to note is that for Filipino citizens, their first contact with Americans came via this U.S. military base. It's important to note that through social media, through television, through popular culture, Filipinos already had an image of what it meant to be or means to be American, right? One that's constructed by Hollywood or news sources. And they were also hearing back from their compatriots who had migrated before them to the United States. I think in particular, it's important to note that for Filipino citizens who live near military bases, their first real impression of Americans came from soldiers serving on the base. And I think, as most of you know, when you look at the commercialism or the types of things that exist around bases, that oftentimes that these represented what Filipinos would consider to be very sinful acts, things like prostitution or human trafficking, men who catcalled women and in particular acted in very sexist ways towards women. That women were often seen as either loose, right, or promiscuous. That it was surrounded by debauchery, drinking, right, and the worst of behaviors. So if this was your first contact with Americans, this of course created a situation in particular for Filipino citizens who eventually migrated to the United States where they would be fearful of how in particular their daughters would be treated. And so these images informed the prejudgments or prejudices that the Filipino parents had and informed many of their reactions to their daughters, or particularly their daughters, becoming too, quote unquote, Americanized. And so being Americanized became synonymous with some of this very bad behavior, in addition to a sense of hyper individualism, that they were not family oriented, and that it was really a deficient culture, which I'll talk a little bit more later. Now, it's important to note if you go back to the theories that we've been studying: assimilation, cultural pluralism, social construction of race. Oftentimes, these theorists falsely assume that immigrants, quote unquote, start accumulating knowledge on the place they're migrating to once they enter the United States. And that these theories start from the place that first contact really occurs in the country that they're migrating to, and in this case, the United States. But that's just not true. Migrants start learning about the United States through news, media, popular culture, and experiences of other migrants years before they actually migrate. This is a really important contribution by Espiritu, because Espiritu essentially debunks the idea that we know nothing, or it's like a tabula rasa when you enter the United States, as if you have you're a blank script that someone has to write on. And she basically says, if we take into consideration the experiences that happen in their homeland, their exposure to media and popular culture, then is it necessarily surprising that the parents and that immigrants feel the way they do about Americans? So this background information feeds into the thesis statement, which is really on the second page of the article, in which she asserts that immigrant communities' culture take a special significance. Not only does it form a lifeline to the home country and a basis for group identity in their new country, it's also a base from which immigrants stake their political and sociocultural claims on their new country. In other words, what this is saying is that it is central to their identity. Maintaining a sense of what it means to be Filipino is really important, particularly in light of the fact that when they migrate to the United States, they often face numerous ways in which they're oppressed based on gender, based on socioeconomic status, based on their race. They are considered inferior in so many ways, right? And there are numerous ways she discusses this in the reading that you should be familiar with. But she also says that the culture becomes increasingly important, and as a result, they assert a form of moral superiority over American culture as a way in which to ground themselves and ground their identity in a way that reaffirms who they are and their self-worth, particularly in the face of colonial racial class and gendered subordination. This is really important because this kind of, again, frames the entire article. So in her article, We Don't Sleep Around Like White Girls Do, She discusses numerous forms of stratification, and three that I want to focus in on are gender, colonization, and immigration. You may also be able to talk about other things like labor market stratification or socioeconomic status. That's not excluded from the field of conversation, but I'm just going to focus on these three. So with gender stratification, it argues that men and women do not have equal access to power, resources, networks, social and political capital, and that this leads to unequal outcomes. And then when you look at the research that's done on gender, we see that men, would be at the top of that pyramid or have increased access to resources, while women had decreased access to resources. As you go through the reading, you should be able to identify ways in which men and women are treated unequally in the text. You should think about things like parental expectations, relationships, education, as well as how siblings, and in particular brothers and sisters, were treated differently. It's very clear here how we see gender stratification occur, and that there are a lot of double standards that in particular the young Filipino women acted out against, right? And so this is important to be able to think about. Now, in terms of stratification based on immigration or immigrant generation, there are a few ways in which you could frame this. How are immigrants treated differently than quote unquote Americans? And there are a number of different ways in which she highlights this, right? How even immigrants who have stayed in the United States, served in jobs for over 20 years, are still considered the other, right? And in particular, based on race, they are never considered Americans. This is something that's really kind of central to part of the argumentation of the article. And then you can also look at stratification based on first generation and second generation within the immigrant group. And here we can see the ways in which either first or second generation men and women are treated differently and have unequal access to resources. You should be able to disaggregate the ways in which the group that you believe is higher up on that sort of stratification pyramid has greater access to resources and greater access to political culture, to social networks and life chances as compared to the other group. Third, you have colonization. And in this case, we're talking about the colonized versus the colonizer. Here, you could talk about the United States as it relates to the Philippines. And oftentimes when we think about this, we want to think about access to resources. And in particular, the colonizers in the United States in this case seek to use a country for its resources, right? And there are different types of resources. I talked about one being military presence, but other times it's the educational system. It can be material resources or natural resources. These are things that you should be able to disaggregate. It's also about the fact that who controls the narrative. Winners tell history. Oftentimes we don't hear about the ways in which the U.S. government has played a role or influence in the Philippines, right? Whether it's through their political systems, whether it's through propping up dictators like Ferdinand Marcos, but these are all other ways in which colonization impacts the country, right, in which we've invaded. And that it's also important to note that through colonization, Filipino culture is often considered inferior, while U.S. culture is considered superior. And she maps this out in particular ways, and you should be able to point to sort of different examples of this in the reading. Now, finally is morality, and this is really where Espiritu sort of flips the script. Espiritu really focuses on the idea that Filipinos assert a sense of moral superiority, and that they argue that Filipino culture was morally superior. And that they talk about this in numerous ways. You should be able to identify ways in which they talk about Filipino culture being much more family-oriented. That they are much more, that their daughters and sons are much, or really their daughters are much more disciplined. They're not overly independent. They construct what it means to be American in a very particular way, and that they see American culture to be morally inferior. And you should be able to identify why the author thought this was important. So at the end of the article, you should be able to provide examples of each type of stratification, understand how the process of racialization occurs before immigrants arrive, and understand how the experiences of migrants impact their impressions and prejudgments of American culture. This is going to be really central to you being able to finish the midterm.